The British Empire at its peak was the biggest empire ever seen on the planet Earth. It was almost 35.5 million kilometres squared and was home to 23% of the entire world population and 24% of Earth's landmass. It was simply a superpower. But it started to collapse in the 20th century and finally dissolve into what is now called the UK. However, what if this empire never collapsed? In this video, I will be highlighting the rise and fall of the British Empire and the outcome if the empire never collapsed. To explain the rise of the British Empire, we have to go back to the 15th century. At the time, Portugal was beginning to expand their trade with different countries. They had already conquered islands such as Madeira and Cape Verde, and so they were already starting to broaden their influence. Quickly after, Portuguese travellers and explorers conquered a small town in North Africa called Ceuta, which is now part of Spain. After this, Spain set their eye on trying to conquer new lands, so they sent out a certain man named Christopher Columbus. His intention was to look for a route to Southeast Asia, to countries like China and India. Instead, by accident, he had landed in the Bahamas. This started the Spanish Empire and began the extreme expansion of the Spaniards in the Americas. Afterwards, this kicked off the Western Europe race. Countries like France, Germany, Netherlands and of course the UK started to build their own empires by exploring and also capturing overseas colonies of other European countries. This is what started colonialism in the Western world and was the beginning of a colonial era. After the Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries, France and Netherlands lost a series of wars in the 17th and 18th century. This put Britain in the driving seat and in the great position to expand into North America. During this North American conquest, they captured many Caribbean islands such as Jamaica and took over many parts of what is now known as America and Canada. Furthermore, the British Empire started to reach into Asia and then became a major power in the Indian subcontinent region. However, in the late 18th century, they began to lose their land in North America in the American War of Independence. But they did retain what is now known as Canada and held control of that land until the early 1900s. In the 19th century, the French lost a series of wars called the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. This made Britain the main naval power in the world and therefore helped them conquer new lands. They landed in Southeast Asia first and then reached into some colonies in Africa. Due to the fact that the empire had colonies in many different regions, it had a lot of dominance in the world trade and practically controlled the economies of many different continents. However, in the 20th century is where the empire began to collapse. In the early 1900s, Germany and the United States began to emerge as global superpowers, challenging Britain's reign over the world. Furthermore, the tensions between Germany and Britain were growing rapidly. This pretty much led to the outbreak of the First World War. This war put a lot of strain on the empire's resources and manpower. Although just after the First World War it was at its biggest size, it was no longer the biggest economy or military, and independence movements were growing across the world. In the Second World War, the colonies they occupied in Asia were all now controlled by the Empire of Japan, who were on the Axis in this war. Although the war was won by the Allied side, the economy was in a dreadful state after spending lots of money on the war. In 1947, Britain's most valuable colony, India, achieved independence through a large decolonisation movement. This movement pressured Britain to grant independence to many other overseas colonies, which rapidly decreased their influence. After this, the Crisis of Suez hit in 1956. This was when Britain tried to invade Israel and Egypt and lost many resources. This caused a rapid decline in manpower and for many ended the empire completely. Although at this point Britain were in a horrible state in terms of military and manpower, they still had sovereignty over 14 territories across the world. Nowadays, countries like Guyana and Nigeria still speak English to this day due to the colonisation, and many former colonies now play English sports such as cricket and football like the Indian subcontinent. Furthermore, in the late 20th century, many people from former British colonies started to immigrate to Britain to find better jobs and opportunities. Now, after that small intermission, we're on to the main subject. What if the British Empire never collapsed? I will be focusing on four main topics: social, economic, technology and relations. The late 20th century and the early 2000s was an important period for many different technology companies. Many of these would have been invented by the Brits due to their expansive resources at hand. They would have oil from the Middle East and cotton from India and many different materials in Africa. The control over the resources that they would have could boost their space exploration. Then they could challenge the US to become the world's biggest exporter, which boosts their economy. After World War II, relations with Russia broke down due to the Cold War and their communism thinking versus Britain and the Western world's democracy. The influence that Russia had over Eastern Europe caused some countries to be part of communism, such as Serbia and Belarus. With Britain's big part in bringing democracy to West Europe, with its power, it could have prevented communism in the east side of Europe. Many big disputes in continents like Antarctica over how much countries own would be altered due to the fact that UN decides these decisions. With the British Empire present, the UN could become a lot less powerful. During the peak of the British Empire, there was a lot of inequality with the different colonies. Some were really fortunate and were provided well, whereas others were neglected and not provided with resources by Britain. With the new equality movements coming in, I think Britain would have been able to balance this inequality while also providing for its own citizens. The inequality is also a key reason as to why many countries long for independence during the decline of the empire. Now, moving on to economic factors. As we already talked about, Britain's political views might have an effect on communistic countries, but also their cultural and linguistic characters would also shape the world by incorporating their architecture and language. This is similar to when many countries use the US dollar to strengthen their economy. Nowadays, the global market for many different things are owned by different countries, such as the oil in the Middle East. The British Empire would dominate these markets, making them very rich and the world's biggest exporter. In colonised regions, Britain would focus on military bases and infrastructure development to ensure the safety of the citizens. This was not implemented in the British Empire, which again was an extreme example of inequality. Britain's financial systems would also rival the ones in America, such as the banks in England and many different crypto schemes. Now we're moving on to social factors. In the past, Britain did invade indigenous spaces, and this affected the population and the languages. Nowadays, they would be more careful to prevent many small languages from going extinct due to the ongoing movements. However, this would lead to the indigenous tribes being isolated with little healthcare and infrastructure. The way Britain managed these colonies 100 years ago wasn't very organised and led to many protests and riots. To solve this, Britain would implement many systems such as the feudal system to manage these colonies and make sure that everything is under control. We've talked about migration briefly, however workers and many people would migrate to London due to it being the financial hub in the world nowadays, and it would be if the British Empire still existed. The fact that Britain would practically own the trade market would lead to many jobs being available, making society more culturally diverse than it is today. In conclusion, the British Empire would be even bigger and stronger than it was 100 years ago. Their economic status would be growing massively, and their influence across the world would be huge due to their part in the trade market. Their international presence would maybe shape the world differently due to the transformative era in the late 20th century. Such as, with Britain, communism might have only stayed in Russia. However, the neglected communities across the world because of Britain's focus on the economy could lead to riots and protests. But with the newest movements of equality, I believe Britain would also focus on these neglected colonies to hopefully prevent any future independence movements. But I don't think the British Empire will reunite anytime soon. However, only time will tell if we find ourselves in another colonial era. Thanks for watching and have a great day.